Did Mary, the mother of Jesus, actually set foot on the shores of England? To many, this sounds like a modern myth, or perhaps a piously crafted legend with no foundation in reality. But history often holds secrets far deeper than the common narrative. And what if I told you that ancient records, preserved for nearly 2,000 years, tell a very different story? If you have ever dived into works like The Coming of the Saints by John W. Taylor, or if you are familiar with the detailed chronicles in St. Joseph of Arimathea at Glastonbury by Lionel Lewis, then you already know that we are dealing with something far more profound than a simple rumor. These scholars did not just invent stories, they followed a trail of evidence that leads from the dusty, sun-drenched roads of Jerusalem to the misty, green valleys of Somerset. After the events of Pentecost, the New Testament becomes remarkably quiet about the daily life of Mary. We know she was entrusted to the Apostle John at the foot of the cross, and we know she was present in the upper room. But where did they go when the persecution in Jerusalem intensified? Most of us are familiar with the tradition of Ephesus in modern-day Turkey. It is a beautiful, sacred place, and the house of the Virgin there is a site of immense pilgrimage. But history is rarely a single straight line. To understand why she might have traveled much further, we have to look at the political climate of the first century. The followers of the Way were not just a new religious group, they were being hunted. After the martyrdom of Stephen, the atmosphere in Judea became toxic for anyone closely associated with Jesus. Exile was not a choice, it was a necessity for survival. For the mother of Jesus, staying in Jerusalem was a death sentence. While many believe she lived out her days in quiet seclusion in Ephesus, there is a persistent ancient whisper that suggests her journey did not end there. Why England? To a modern mind, the distance seems impossible. We think of the ancient world as a place of isolation, where a journey from the Middle East to the British Isles would be like a trip to the moon. But this is our first mistake. The Roman world was more connected than we often realize. The Mediterranean was a highway of commerce, and beyond the Pillars of Hercules lay the Atlantic routes that had been traveled for centuries. The key to this entire mystery lies in the identity of a man named Joseph of Arimathea. In the Gospels, he is a noble counselor, a man of great wealth and influence who provided his own tomb for the burial of Jesus. But outside the biblical text, historical traditions describe him as something more, a merchant prince with a specific interest in the mining industry. The most precious resource for the Roman Empire, essential for making bronze, was tin, and the primary source for tin in the ancient world was Cornwall, in the southwest of England. If Joseph of Arimathea had the ships, the wealth, and the established trade routes to reach the British Isles, the question is no longer, could they get there, but rather, why wouldn't they? The traditions of the West are consistent in asserting that Joseph of Arimathea, accompanied by a small company of disciples, brought the Christian faith to the shores of Britain shortly after the Passion. The Coming of the Saints, John W. Taylor. This assertion by Taylor points to a reality that many modern historians overlook. The early church did not just spread through the sermons of Peter and Paul in the great cities of the East. It moved through the veins of the empire, through trade, through family connections, and through the desperate search for safety. If Joseph was indeed a relative or a close protector of the Holy Family, his primary mission during the height of the Herodian persecution would have been the safety of Mary. Imagine the scene, a merchant vessel heavily laden with supplies slipping out of a port like Caesarea or Joppa. On board is a woman who has witnessed the most pivotal events in human history, now seeking refuge at the very edge of the known world. They weren't just traveling into the unknown, they were traveling to a place where Joseph already had friends, business partners, and a presence. This brings us to the coast of Britain, a land the Romans called Britannia. It was a place of druids, of ancient stone circles, and of a people who had not yet been fully conquered by the Roman eagle. It was the perfect place to disappear. It was a place where the reach of the Sanhedrin could not follow, and where even the Roman governors were more concerned with tribal wars than with a small group of Hebrew exiles. But did she actually go? When we look at the oldest records of the British Church, we find a curious pride. Unlike the churches in Gaul or Spain, which often traced their origins to later missionaries sent from Rome, the British Church claimed an apostolic origin that was direct. They believed they received the light of the gospel while the wounds of the crucifixion were still fresh. In the 11th century, the historian William of Malmesbury was commissioned to write the history of Glastonbury. He was a man of great academic rigor for his time, and he was granted access to the ancient archives of the abbey, documents that have since been lost to fire and time. What he found there surprised him. He recorded that there was a small church of wattle work that the locals claimed had been built not by monks, but by the very hands of the disciples of the Lord. This old church of wattle work built by Joseph and his companions was the first altar of Christ in the land, and it was from the very beginning dedicated to the memory of the Blessed Virgin. St. Joseph of Arimathea at Glastonbury, Lionel Lewis. The dedication of this church is the smoking gun. In the 1st century, it was highly unusual to dedicate a church to a living person or even a recently deceased one unless there was a direct, physical connection to that place. If Mary was just a distant figure in Ephesus, why would a group of refugees in the cold, damp hills of Somerset build a shrine in her name? The tradition suggests they didn't just build it for her memory, they built it because of her presence. As we look at the evidence, we have to weigh the silence of the Scriptures against the eloquence of the tradition. The Bible is not an exhaustive diary of every day in the life of the apostles. It is a theological record of the spread of the gospel in the East. But the West has its own memory, a memory of a mother, a merchant, and a journey across the sea to a land that would eventually become known as Our Lady's Dowry. The journey to England was not a vacation, it was an act of faith and a search for sanctuary. As we move deeper into the records of Glastonbury and the mysterious Glastonbury thorn, the legend begins to take on the weight of history. We are not just talking about a story told by grandfathers, we are talking about a foundation upon which an entire nation's faith was built. To understand how such a journey was even possible, we have to dismantle the myth that the ancient world was disconnected. The Roman Empire was a web of trade, and the veins of that web were the shipping lanes. Joseph of Arimathea, described as a nobilis decorio, held a position that likely gave him oversight of mining operations, a role that required constant contact with the farthest reaches of the imperial frontiers. This is not mere speculation. Archaeological finds across Cornwall and the Mendip Hills have unearthed Mediterranean pottery and Roman coins dating back to the very dawn of the 1st century, proving that the route from the Levant to the British Isles was well trodden long before the Roman legions officially invaded under Emperor Claudius. If Joseph was indeed a merchant prince, his ships were not small fishing boats. They were massive cargo vessels, capable of carrying hundreds of tons of grain, wine, and metals. For a group seeking to escape the intense scrutiny of the Roman Jewish authorities in Jerusalem, these merchant vessels offered the ultimate sanctuary. They were the private jets of the ancient world. On such a vessel, Mary would not have been a passenger on a public ferry. She would have been under the protection of a man whose wealth and status provided a shield of anonymity. The route itself is a fascinating study in ancient navigation. Leaving the shores of Judea, a ship would pass the island of Cyprus, skirt the southern coast of Asia Minor, and perhaps make a stop in the bustling ports of Alexandria or Sicily. But instead of turning toward Rome, the heart of the beast that had crucified her son, the vessel would have continued westward, passing through the narrow Strait of Gibraltar, known then as the Pillars of Hercules. Beyond that point lay the vast, terrifying Atlantic. To many in the East, this was the end of the world, a place of monsters and eternal mist. But to a tin merchant, it was simply the way home. The tradition suggests that they landed in the southwest, likely in Cornwall or at the mouth of the River Parrett in Somerset. For a woman who had lived her entire life in the dry, rocky landscape of Galilee and Judea, the sight of the British coastline must have been a shock. Instead of the golden heat of the Middle East, she was met with a spectrum of greens she had never imagined, a land where the earth felt damp and the air was thick with the scent of the sea and ancient forests. This was not a land of marble temples and Roman law. It was a wilderness at the edge of the map. But why would Joseph bring her here, of all places? The answer lies in the safety of the unconquered. While the Romans had a presence in Britain, they did not yet have total control. The local tribes, led by their Druid priests, were fiercely independent. Curiously, many historians of the 19th century noted that the Druids held a theology that was surprisingly compatible with the early Christian message, a belief in a singular creative force and the immortality of the soul. This created a unique pocket of safety. Here, the mother of Jesus was not a political target. She was a guest of a respected merchant in a land that the long arm of the Sanhedrin could not reach. As they moved inland toward what we now call Glastonbury, they arrived at a place that was already considered sacred. In the 1st century, Glastonbury was almost an island surrounded by marshes and water, known as the Isle of Avalon. It was a natural fortress, accessible only by boat or narrow trackways. It was here, according to the records found by William of Malmesbury, that the local king granted Joseph and his 12 companions 12 hides of land. The king, though not converted to the faith himself, admired their way of life and granted them a place of retreat in a desolate outskirts of his kingdom, where they could practice their religion without fear of persecution. This grant of land is one of the most persistent legal traditions in British history. Even in the Domesday Book, compiled centuries later by William the Conqueror, the 12 hides of Glastonbury remained a tax-exempt entity, a legal anomaly that points back to a very real and very ancient land grant. It was on this land that the Old Church was constructed. Imagine the scene: the mother of the Messiah helping to gather the reeds and the clay to build a humble circular hut that would become the first Christian temple in the West. This was not the Grand Vatican or the ornate cathedrals of later centuries. It was a Vetusta Ecclesia, an ancient church of wattle and daub. This simplicity is exactly what makes the story so believable. It lacks the exaggerated grandeur of later medieval forgeries. It speaks of a small group of refugees building a shelter for their faith and for the woman they were sworn to protect. The presence of Mary in this community would have changed everything. To the early British converts, she was the living link to the events of the gospel. She was the one who could describe the face of the Savior, the sound of his voice, and the reality of the resurrection. If the British Church felt a sense of superiority over the Roman missions that arrived later, it was because they believed they had sat at the feet of the Mother herself. John Y. Taylor, in his extensive research, highlights that the saints who came to Britain were not just random missionaries, they were the inner circle. He suggests that the group included not only Joseph, but also figures like Martha and Mary Magdalene, who were said to have landed first in Marseille before some of the party continued toward the tin mines of the north. This creates a picture of a coordinated effort to preserve the most important witnesses of the faith by scattering them to the furthest reaches of the world. As Mary lived out her years in the quiet isolation of Avalon, she would have seen the first generation of British Christians born into the faith. This was the springtime of the church, occurring in the wintry climate of the north. The tradition tells us that she spent her time in prayer and contemplation, looking out over the Somerset levels, a landscape that became a new Nazareth for her. But what about the physical evidence? Skeptics often point out that wood and reed do not survive 2,000 years of English reign. This is true. However, the memory of the site was so sacred that the great stone abbey of Glastonbury was eventually built. It was constructed around the site of the old church, preserving its location as the holiest ground in England. The medieval monks treated the space where the Wattle Church once stood with a reverence that surpassed even their respect for the graves of kings. This brings us to one of the most famous symbols of this journey, the Glastonbury thorn. The story goes that Joseph of Arimathea arrived at Weary-all Hill and struck his staff into the ground, and it took root and bloomed. To a skeptic, this is pure folklore, but to a botanist, there is a mystery here. The Crataegus monogyna biflora, as it is known, is not a native British tree. It does not bloom once a year like other hawthorns. It blooms twice, once in the spring and once at Christmas. Most importantly, it is a variety of hawthorn that is native to the Levant, to the region of Judea. How did a Middle Eastern tree come to grow on a specific hill in Somerset, and why does it bloom at the very time the world celebrates the birth of Mary's son? If we reject the supernatural element, we are left with a biological fact. Someone traveled from the Holy Land to Glastonbury and brought a living piece of their home with them. And who would have more reason to want a living reminder of the hills of Judea than a woman living in exile thousands of miles from the home she left behind? The historical weight of Mary's potential presence in Britain is not merely a matter of folklore. It is deeply embedded in the ancient title of England as Our Lady's Dowry. This title, Dos Maria, was not a medieval invention, but a recognition of a relationship that the British people believed had existed since the dawn of the faith. In the minds of the early British Christians, their land didn't just receive the gospel, it provided a home for the mother of the gospel. This sense of personal connection is what fueled the unique spiritual identity of the British Isles long before the arrival of St. Augustine of Canterbury in the year 597. When we examine the timeline of Mary's life, we find a window of roughly 15 to 20 years following the resurrection that remains a mystery. If she was in her late teens at the time of Jesus' birth, she would have been in her late 40s or early 50s during the height of the persecutions in Jerusalem. This was an age of great maturity, but certainly not too old for travel in the ancient world, especially under the protection of a wealthy benefactor like Joseph of Arimathea. The journey from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic was arduous, yes, but for those whose lives were in constant danger, the relative peace of the British Isles was worth every storm and every mile of open sea. One of the most intriguing aspects is the silent evidence found in the linguistics and place names of the West Country. Around Glastonbury and the surrounding moors, there are ancient names and localized traditions that seem out of place in a purely Celtic or Roman context. There are references to the Holy House and the secret place of the Mother. For a population of over 30,000 people today, Glastonbury is a tourist destination, but for the ancients, it was a sanctuary. The local people did not view the arrivals as conquerors or even as traditional refugees. They viewed them as saints, men and women who carried a light that had never been seen in the West. Lionel Lewis, in his lifelong study of these records, pointed out that the antiquity of the British Church was so well regarded in the Middle Ages that at several ecclesiastical councils, the British bishops were given precedence over the bishops of France and Spain. The reason cited? The British Church was founded by the very hands of those who had known the Lord, including the presence of the Blessed Mother. This was a legal and religious fact accepted by the highest authorities of the time. It suggests that the records we now consider lost or legendary were once part of a documented history that the entire Christian world respected. History may be silent, but tradition is eloquent. The footprints of the Mother of Jesus in Glastonbury are not written in ink, but in the very heart of the British Church. If we look at the geography of Glastonbury, we see why it was chosen. It was a place of high ground surrounded by water, a tor that rose above the mists. It was a place where one could see an enemy approaching from miles away, yet it was secluded enough to offer a life of quiet prayer. For Mary, who had survived the trauma of the crucifixion and the subsequent chaos in Judea, the silence of Avalon must have been a profound mercy. The legends describe her walking the hillsides, perhaps looking out toward the Bristol Channel, knowing that her son's message was now taking root in a soil that Rome had not yet broken. This brings us to a difficult question for many. If this is true, why is it not in the Bible? The answer lies in the very nature of the New Testament itself. The book of Acts and the epistles of Paul are focused on the mission to the Gentiles and the establishment of the church within the infrastructure of the Roman Empire. The writers were documenting the public expansion of the faith. But the journey of Mary and Joseph of Arimathea was a private mission of protection. It was a hidden history, kept within the families and the oral traditions of the British tribes. Not every act of the apostles was written down, and not every journey was meant for the public record of the time. Consider the Glastonbury thorn once more. Beyond the miracle, there is the biological reality. This tree, which blooms at Christmas and in the spring, is a living witness to a connection with the Levant. It is a tangible biological bridge across thousands of miles. Even today, a sprig of this thorn is sent to the British monarch every Christmas, a tradition that persists as a reminder of the ancient roots of the British faith. If the tree came from the east, it was brought by someone. And if someone brought a tree from the Judean hills, they were bringing a piece of a world they intended to leave behind forever. The impact of this journey on the early British people cannot be overstated. It transformed Britain from a distant outpost of the empire into a holy land of the West. The belief that Mary had lived and perhaps even been buried in the soil of Avalon turned Glastonbury into the second Rome. Even the great King Arthur was later tied to this location, with legends suggesting he was a descendant of the very family that protected Mary. While these later stories add layers of myth, they all sprout from the same ancient seed, the belief that the Holy Family had a physical presence in Britain. As we move toward the conclusion of this investigation, we have to look at the old church of Wattle and Daub one last time. It survived for centuries, protected by a lead casing in later years, until it was finally destroyed by a great fire in 1184. When that fire burned, the monks of Glastonbury wept not just for a building, but for what they called the secret of the Lord. They believed they had lost the physical structure that had once sheltered the Mother of God. But while the wood and clay are gone, the site remains. To this day, people of all faiths, and even those of no faith, remark on the stillness of the grounds where that humble church once stood. In a world that demands a digital footprint and photographic proof for everything, the story of Mary in England asks us to look at a different kind of evidence. It asks us to look at the persistence of memory. It asks us to consider why a nation would cling to a single story for 2,000 years if there were not a grain of truth at its center. The journey to the shores of Britain was not an impossibility, it was a logistical reality for a man of Joseph's status and a spiritual necessity for a woman of Mary's significance. The records of Taylor and Lewis are not just books on a shelf, they are the collected whispers of a history that refuses to be forgotten. If Mary did spend her final years in the quiet sanctuary of Glastonbury, her departure from this world would have been the most sacred event in the history of the British Isles. While many traditions point to her dormition in Jerusalem or Ephesus, the ancient British records suggest a different kind of ending, a quiet passing in the heart of Avalon, surrounded by the small community of disciples who had crossed the world to protect her. This is where the distinction between history and tradition becomes most delicate. For the people of Glastonbury, the earth itself is a reliquary. They believed that the old church was not just a place where she prayed, but a place that was saturated with her presence. In the centuries that followed, the Abbey of Glastonbury grew to become one of the wealthiest and most powerful in Europe, but its prestige never came from its gold or its stone walls. It came from its title as the Second Rome. Pilgrims from across the continent traveled to these Somerset marshes because they believed that the ground held a secret that Rome itself could not claim, the physical resting place, however temporary, of the mother of Jesus. But why would such a monumental fact be obscured over time? To understand this, we have to look at the rise of the Roman Church and its eventual dominance over the indigenous British Church. When the Roman missions arrived in the late 6th century, they brought with them a centralized authority and a desire for uniformity. The local British traditions, which were direct, apostolic, and independent, were often viewed as a threat or as peasant folklore. Over time, the grand narratives of the Mediterranean centers took precedence, and the humble wattle and daub history of Britain was pushed into the shadows of myth and legend. Yet the silence of the official annals does not mean the events never occurred. In the works of Lionel Lewis, he argues that the very survival of the Glastonbury traditions through the Viking raids, the Norman conquest, and the Protestant Reformation is a miracle in itself. Why would the monks risk their lives to hide and preserve records of a journey to Britain if the story were merely a late medieval invention? They did so because they believed they were the custodians of a truth that predated the empire. They were the keepers of the hidden years of the Virgin. If you look at the landscape of England today, you can still see the echoes of this belief. From the Lady Chapels and every great cathedral to countless wells and springs named in her honor, the presence of Mary is woven into the geography. This isn't just religious devotion, it is a cultural memory. For an audience that values the weight of history, we must ask, does a nation call itself Our Lady's Dowry for 1,000 years based on a total vacuum? Or is it because at some point in the deep past, a woman of incomparable importance actually walked those fields? The story of Mary in England is ultimately a story of sanctuary. It is a story of a mother seeking peace after a lifetime of unimaginable sorrow and world-changing events. It is a story of a merchant, Joseph of Arimathea, who used his worldly means to provide a heaven on earth for the woman who had brought heaven to earth. When we look at books like The Coming of the Saints, we aren't just reading dry academic theories. We are reading the blueprints of a journey that defined the soul of the West. As we reach the final minutes of this exploration, let us reflect on the biological mystery of the Glastonbury thorn once more. A tree from the Levant blooming in the winter of Britain, on a hill where a merchant's staff was said to have struck the ground. It is a living metaphor for the faith itself, something born in the heat of the East that found a way to survive and flourish in the cold of the North. Whether you view this journey as a literal historical fact or as a profound spiritual tradition, its impact is undeniable. It tells us that the message of the gospel was never meant to be confined to one city or one culture. It was a message that traveled on merchant ships, crossed dangerous seas, and found a home in the most unlikely of places. If the mother of Jesus did indeed spend her twilight years looking out over the misty vales of Somerset, she would have seen a land that was being transformed by her son's words. She would have seen the first old church become a beacon for an entire island. She would have seen that her journey, however long and difficult, had led to the creation of a new sanctuary for the faith. We may never find a first-century inscription in the Somerset clay that bears her name. We may never have the archaeological certainty that modern science demands. But history is more than just objects in a museum. History is the living memory of a people. And for the people of this ancient land, the memory of Mary's journey is as real as the hills of Glastonbury itself. As we close the pages of Taylor and Lewis, and as we look back at the evidence we've gathered, the question remains for you to decide. Was it a legend crafted to give a nation a sense of identity? Or was it the final hidden act of a mother's life, a journey to the end of the world to find the peace that the world could not give? Perhaps the answer lies in the silence of Avalon, a silence that has spoken to the hearts of pilgrims for 2,000 years. Thank you for embarking on this 30-minute journey into the depths of our shared past. The shores of Britain may be far from the streets of Jerusalem, but in the realm of faith and tradition, they are closer than we think. If you wish to learn more, I encourage you to look into the sources mentioned today and explore the records for yourself, because sometimes the most important stories are the ones that were never meant to be shouted from the rooftops, but whispered in the quiet halls of history. Until next time, keep searching for the truth that lies beneath the surface.